Hello everyone and welcome to our third Wednesday program. My name is Miranda and I'm the educator here at Rome Historical Society. We're very happy that we're able to continue to offer our monthly programming virtually to all of you. It's been quite a learning experience, but we appreciate all of you who tune in, watch our videos, and continue to support us. So thank you. Just a few reminders for our audience. Make sure you like, comment, and share this video so we know you're watching and you can share it with your friends. You can visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/RomeHistorical, or our website, romehistoricalsociety.org, for the most up-to-date information about all our upcoming programs and exciting things we're working on. So today we are pleased to have Bob Allers here with us to talk about the cooper's trade. So specifically tools and techniques used to make wooden containers, like casks, buckets, and barrels. So thank you so much for being with us today, Bob.
My pleasure.
So from what I know, Bob, you're quite a history enthusiast, and you were a park ranger at Fort Stanwix for a number of years. I know you play the bugle. You have an extensive knowledge of natural history and geology of the area. So you've got a lot of interests, but today we're going to be talking about the cooper's trade, which you're also proficient in. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can get started with your presentation and tell us all about it.
Thank you. I started coopering while I was working at Fort Stanwix in the summer of 2000, and was asked by one of the other rangers who had done quite a bit of coopering if I'd be interested in trying it. So I did and really enjoyed it. Went and took some classes at Genesee Country Village Museum, did some work training out at Old Sturbridge Village, and learned the trade of coopering. And I've been doing it for about 21 years now. Getting better and better. A young man would start at the age of about 14 as a cooper and would be an apprentice for 7 years. At the end of those 7 years, he'd become a journeyman and then work with other master coopers to learn the trade more. And at the end of those 7 years as a journeyman and 7 years training as an apprentice, at the end of the 14 years, he might become a master in his own right by producing a masterpiece. The objects that I make, there are two of them in the picture here. This picture was done by Kevin Gray at the Farmers Museum, and it's a tintype. It's an old style photograph done with a wooden box camera. And people often say, boy, that looks just like your great-grandfather. And yes, it does, but that's me in the summer of 2018. The tools of coopering are very important. It took me many years to gather and collect and learn how to use a lot of the tools. And here's an image of me with my portable coopering shop set up on the front lawn of the Bump Tavern at the Farmers Museum. Now this had a little special interest to me because Ezekiel Tuttle, who built the Bump Tavern back in the 1800s, is a relative of my wife. Her great aunt Lucy lived in this house when it was a boarding house, and my father-in-law spent his summers here. So I have the opportunity to sit in front of a family home and portray a cooper of the 1800s, the early 19th century. You notice a couple of things in the photograph. My cooper's horse, which I made by hand with no power tools. I'm sitting at the horse with my feet on the pedal. I can use that pedal to hold the jaws of the horse and keep the goods that I'm working on tight to the horse so that I can have both hands free to work the tools. And I'm using a draw knife. At the base of the cooper's horse, you can see a bucket. Behind it, you can see a butter churn, all objects that I've created as part of my coopering demonstrations. What is a cooper? A cooper, as Miranda mentioned earlier, is one who constructs wooden objects for holding goods. They may be fluids, liquids, and that's the job of the wet or tight cooper. Wine, beer, ale, spirits, things like that. The dry or slack cooper makes containers for dry goods, flour, wheat, apples, nails. That container does not have to be watertight. And the wet cooper generally makes 2 to 3 times the amount of money as a dry or slack cooper does. The word cooper comes from the Old Norse "coop," or the German "Kufer" or "Cooper," and the Roman "kupa," cup, container for holding a liquid. Most cooper shops were pretty plain or simple dwellings. This is the cooper shop that's been reconstructed at Genesee Country Village and Museum. It's a house that was moved there, and in the interior is the cooper shop. And notice there's no sign out front, but there's a cask hanging over the door. That tells you that it's the coopers. And most cooper shops that I've seen are pretty similar inside. The white cooper is primarily what I do. I do the work of a white cooper, household goods for water, milk, butter, maple sap, lots of different objects that you don't have to worry about the tannins in the wood. The white cooper primarily uses pine, spruce, fir, and that won't impart the tannins like oak will, excuse me, to the liquid inside. It won't sour the milk. It won't cause the butter to spoil. So the white cooper is generally the work that I do. And notice that the objects are fairly light in color. Here in this picture by the well in front of my house, you can see original and reproduction 18th, 19th, and 20th century tools. We'll talk a lot of these tools on the bucket that's sitting on top of the darker brown cask. You can see my hoop driver and a hammer for driving those hoops down onto the container. To the left, the whiter object is the cooper's horse. The one just to the right of that is the cooper's joiner or plane. And we'll talk about some of these tools in a little while. That's been half the fun of being a cooper, is learning to recognize, learn how to use, and to collect all of the various tools. Again, examples of the white cooper's work. These are things that I have made over the years. A small cup or a container for axle grease, the tiny one over on to your left as you're looking at the image. Flower pots, love to put these out in the fall with buns in them. Buckets, pails, and there is a difference between a pail and a bucket. We'll talk about that in just a second. On the right, you can see a cask. A cask may be narrow at the top and narrow at the bottom. It may taper narrow at the top and wider at the bottom. Or it may taper from the bottom upward or get wider from the bottom upward and be narrow at the bottom and get wider at the top. What is the difference between a pail and a cask? On the right, or excuse me, a pail and a bucket. A cask is one that's generally closed at both ends, or is a larger, just pretty much straight or curved at bottom and top. The pail is the one on the left. Think of a water pail for the horse. It's wide at the top, narrow at the bottom. So the horse can stick his head in and drink out of the pail. A bucket on the right is much easier for carrying liquid goods in. If you're going to swab the decks of a ship, you'll fill the bucket with water, and it's narrow at the top so that the water doesn't slosh out. So at a well, you'd have a bucket that drops down into the well. To water your livestock, to feed your livestock, you generally use a pail. So the bucket, narrow at the top, wide at the bottom. The pail, wide at the top, narrow at the bottom. The tight or wet cooper makes containers and repairs containers for liquids. On the right, you'll see Nate George, one of my fellow coopers, and myself repairing a cask, a quarter keg, or an eighth of a barrel. And that would be the job of the wet cooper, to repair kegs or casks at the breweries. And there were a number of breweries here in Rome. One that is active today is the Copper City Brewery. And I was tightening up a cask from the Fort Stanwix Brewery that is now in the collection at the Copper City Brewing Company. On the left is a container that I repaired and cleaned up from the West End Brewing Company for a dealer in antiques that's a former student of mine. Now, what do I mean by a cask or a keg or a barrel? Everybody kind of looks at these things and say they look like barrels. Well, a barrel is a specific size container, about 32 gallons. These are wine containers. The same names refer to beer containers. And typically in beer containers, we use a barrel, a half barrel or a kilderkin, or a quarter barrel, a firkin. And that small cask that we were tightening up in the previous slide was a firkin. It's about 8 gallons. The kilderkin, which I make, firkins, kilderkins, I haven't made a barrel yet. That's pretty good size. I've repaired a couple. It's 32 gallons. And then a hogshead is 63, 64 gallons. Those are pretty commonly used for shipping dry goods, liquids. And then the largest containers are called a ton, T-U-N. And at the end of the program, we'll take a look at a ton that's very, very large. What do they use the coopered objects for? The one on the left is a wash tub that I made, holds about 17 gallons, and it's used for laundry. I learned something very interesting in making this object that was about 39 inches tall. The owner didn't want the top to be smoothed or rounded, wanted it sharp. That's what they used to use, like the washboard for cleaning the laundry. And on most containers, like the casks that the peddler is carrying on his back, and both the objects in both of these pictures are reproduced from 18th century paintings. The peddler carrying 2 casks that I made, the 2 on the bottom with the metal hoops, the one on the top with wooden hoops. Metal hoops were much more common from about 1740, 1750 on. The British Navy went to all metal hoops on board their ships in 1740. But in local areas, in rural areas, it was much more common to use wooden shaved twigs, saplings, to make the hoops. They're much less expensive, much easier to come by, but they take much longer to make. And you need about 2 to 4 of them to equal the strength of one metal hoop. To make the staves and the hoops, the staves are the wooden pieces that fit together to make the cask or the barrel or the bucket. And the hoops are the metal rings that hold everything together. On the left, we have some stave making tools. The froe in the center bottom is a straight froe. You can use that for making shingles. You can split logs with it. You can make staves from it. The curved one in the upper left will make curved staves so that you don't have to trim away as much material. The 2 hammers on the right, one is a hammer with a little groove in it for using as a hoop driver. The smaller hammer is a cooper's adze. It has a very sharp side for trimming the inside and the top of the cask. To the left of those and underneath the curved froe, you can see 2 hoop drivers for hammering the hoops down. And on the far lower right, or on the lower right in the left-hand image, you can see a chamfer, which is used for smoothing the inside of the containers. Over on the right-hand side on the top is a piece of hoop steel, 1 inch thick. I would get that from the blacksmith, and I would do all of the work on that cold and punch it with the punches inside the ring. The ring is a hoop that has been fastened together with rivets. I'd punch a hole, drive the rivets down, and hammer them down with a hammer. In the right-hand picture, up in the upper right, is a gimlet. Has a little screw head on top or on the bottom for grabbing a hold of the head and pulling the head into the top of the cask. That's what the head is, to pull that head into the groove at the top. On the upper left is a bung borer for cutting the bung to be able to fill the container. A set of dividers or calipers for measuring the distance around to be able to cut the right size for the head. On the right, a scorp, the two-handled object. The scorp, and that's one of my oldest tools from about the 1750s. That's used for trimming the inside of the container and smoothing it. The two-handled object just below it, the flat wooden-handled one, is a downshave used for trimming the outside of the bucket or cask. And then below that is a curved draw knife that's used to hollow the inside of the containers, or hollow the inside of the staves. And the straight knife or backing knife is used to trim the outside of the staves, to take a square piece of wood and turn it into a curve. Beneath that is a bit, and under that the brace for drilling the holes to put the handles in, or I can use it to drill the bung hole or the spigot hole for the container. Here's the cooper's axe. I can use that to dress the staves, and the froe, which is also used to split the staves. And you can see a piece of a log that has been split to start the stave. I could dress that to trim it and taper it, and I'll begin to use the knives to shape it. Most wood that's used for coopering is quarter sawn, which we see on the right-hand side of this image. Plain sawn is what most lumber that we know today is cut as. Plain sawn is a very efficient way to cut the logs. I have an Amish neighbor with a mill down behind my house, and he does almost all of his cutting with his work with plain sawn lumber. There's less wastage, and you get some very nice, strong boards. There's a lot of strength to the way the grain goes in the plain sawn lumber. Quarter sawn lumber on the right has more wastage, but the grain goes perpendicular to the flat surface of the board. We'll take a look at that in just a minute. But the way that the growth rings line up on the quarter sawn lumber, it does not leak as much, and you'll have less loss and less shrinkage in the container. And shrinkage can be a real problem in the containers. In this image, we can see the curved furrow for splitting the stave blanks. And on the right, we have some sawn lumber, plain sawn, with the grain going almost parallel to the surface, and the quarter sawn on the right, with the grains going 90 degrees or vertical to the surface. On the left, we have some staves that are cut from a split log, shaped with a straight saw with a bow saw, and then trimmed. And you notice the one on the right-hand side of the left image, you can see the curve to the stave. On the right-hand side, we have a board, plain sawn lumber, just like I get from the mill at Hanford Mills. And to the right of that is a quarter sawn stave. And as we look at those grains, you can see the vertical direction. And we go back one more slide, see the vertical grain on the stave. That's quarter sawn lumber on the right and plain sawn lumber on the left. When the staves are cut, they usually would cut them in the wintertime. Go out to the woods, cut the trees, drag them out, split them or saw them, stack them up next to the cooper shop and let them dry for a year before they're used for making staves. These are outside the cooper shop at the Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. And once the staves are all made up and the container is all put together, to be used on ships, they would shook the staves up, put a whole bunch of staves inside of a set of rings as the diagram on the right, and it takes up less space on the ship. So when you go out for sailing for a year or 2 years on a whaling ship, you'd shook up all the containers that you're going to use to put the whale oil in and take your food in other barrels or casks. And then when those barrels got emptied, you would take those apart. And when you're ready to put the whale oil in the containers, you'd put the casks back together. And almost every sailing ship had a cooper on board to take care of the water buckets, to take care of the containers that the goods were shipped in. And in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, almost everything was shipped by barrel or some type of cask. Here we have the structure and terminology of the staves and the cask. You can see the staves, the bunghole in the center, lined up with the rivets on the hoops to give it strength. The bilge hoop or booge hoop, the quarter hoop, the head hoop or the chime hoop. And the head can be made in a number of pieces, or it could be one solid piece. The staves on the right start out as straight boards, get trimmed on the inside, trimmed on the outside, and then listed or run down the jointer and made narrower at the top or at the bottom, or in the case of a cask, the top and bottom. You would dowel and pin the joints to join the pieces of the head together, as in the far right of the diagram. And the head would be trimmed to have a very narrow edge that would go into a specific type of groove called a croze. We'll take a look at that in a minute. Here we have 3 apprentice coopers down at Hanford Mills working on 3 different jointers, basically inverted floor planes. And they are shaping the staves. Take a straight board, you trim it, and you can make it narrower at the top and leave it a little wider at the bottom. And you can also put an angle or a bevel on it. Here we have the jointer or the plane that the cooper uses to bevel the edge of the staves. The jointer has 2 blades on it. One's a little higher than the other one. The higher one is for coarse work, to cut a lot of the stave off, to trim it down very quickly. And the lower height is to trim it and get a very, very smooth, finished side to it. You notice that there's an angle on the stave on the left. That angle is dependent upon the number of staves that you're using. And if you're doing 360 degrees, you have 20 staves, there's going to be a very specific angle to that stave. So the angle is dependent upon the number of staves. On the right, you can see the angle or the bevel on that curved stave, and it's trimmed on the edge. And then I'm able to take the draw knife and trim the top or back the stave. And here we have on the left a hollow draw knife or a curved draw knife for hollowing the staves, for trimming the inside of the staves. And where that draw knife is, if you look up just above it, you can see a little jig with an angle on it. That angle is set to the specific number of staves. So that little jig will tell me exactly the angle that I'm using on the staves. That one would be for a 14 stave bucket. And you can see that in the stave on the right. In the stave on the right, I use the straight draw knife to pull toward me and trim the back of the stave and round it. So when you put them all together, it forms a curved object. Here I am at the Cooper's horse, using the curved draw knife on the left to hollow that stave. And notice in the image on the right, I have my feet on the pedals and the goods being held in the jaws, and I'm using the curved draw knife to back the stave. At the bottom on the ground, you can see a bunch of shavings. We use those shavings later on to help form the containers. When you've got all the staves made, you just stand them up in a specific regular sized raising up hoop. I have a number of these for the different objects that I'm making. And making a bucket, I have a certain size. And then I will custom make hoops for each bucket. I'll take a piece of string, measure around, add 2 inches, punch holes, hammer the rivets, and then I fuller the inside of the hoop. Now, wait a minute, what do you mean by fuller? I hammer it on the anvil and expand the hoop on the bottom side so it fits the angle on the container. And here, one of my apprentices is hammering on the hoop to fuller that or spread the metal so that it fits the angle of the container. And you can see that on this object right here, it tapers downward. So this side, the top side, has been fullered to expand it and fit that broader piece at the top. And then I'll drive in the rivets. And you can see the rivets right here on this object that I've got. And that's what holds the containers together. You don't need glue. You don't need any nails. It's the pressure of the hoops that holds everything together. And you increase that pressure by driving the hoops downward. So I measure the cask with a piece of string, add 2 inches, make the hoop, drive it on. To make the head, I cut the head, cut a piece of wood, either one single piece or a couple of pieces doweled together and fit tightly. And then I'll join them together. I may glue them. I may put a piece of cattail frond in between, like a gasket. Cattail frond would be referred to as flagging. And you can use that to fill in any gaps in the bucket that you make, or any mistakes that the cooper makes, or any problems you have with the grain of the wood. I use a ball peen hammer to hammer the rivets, which you can see sitting on the head inside the bow of the saw in the left-hand diagram. And I'll also use a cold chisel to cut the hoop steel. You can see that chisel and the ball peen hammer and the punches in the close-up view on the left. You can see me hammering down the hoops, tightening those on, and you can really hammer on them pretty strongly to hold the hoops in place. Here you can see the bow saw, and here I have the head on the right-hand image, trimming the edge down to get that very narrow edge that will fit into a groove at the top of the cask. And here we can see the crows or the groove. That groove is cut with a very special tool. The inside bevel on the head fits inside of there. And on the left-hand side of that at 11 and 10, you can see the joint and the dowel on the head, where a head made of several pieces can be put together. The crows or the groove is cut with that specific tool called the crows. And I can also use a howl plane to trim that down. See the chiv or howl there. And that will go right into the top. To put the head in, you simply loosen up the hoops, drive the head down in, To take it off, just loosen up the hoops and pop it back out. Here we can see different tools for the head of the container. I have a chisel crows, which has a sharp blade like a chisel that is curved, and on the other side of that, there'll be two knife blades. The knife blades will cut where the groove's going to go, and the chisel will dig it out. I also have a sawtooth crows, one of my first crows is, and I like using that for buckets. The chisel crows is better for casks, but the sawtooth crows is better for buckets. And then down on the bottom here, I have two sun planes. There's a left-handed one and a right-handed one. Not because they were left-handed or right-handed coopers, but because of the different directions of the grain of the wood. Here you can see that chisel crows, or excuse me, the sawtooth crows, and it cuts that groove inside the top of the cask. On the right-hand image, you can see the teeth on the sawtooth crows. They've got a little sawdust on them, but that's the blade. It's made from a piece of an old file and put into a wooden holder, and that allows you to cut the groove. Once the groove is cut, you can smooth the inside of the container, place the head down inside of it. You can see the head and how that fits into the bottom on the left-hand diagram. I can use the scorp to trim out any rough edges on the inside, and I can use the rasp to smooth the top of the container. And notice on the bucket that I'm working on that my wife took the picture of, it's narrow at the top, wider at the bottom. That's a bucket. To make a cask, you need to taper it at both ends. You can put them together pretty easily to start it, but then the other end, they flare out, almost like the petals of a flower, and you need to draw those in to tighten up the container. To draw those in, you use a thing called the Dutch hand or a winch. The first one I used was a Dutch hand, and they work pretty well, but you put a lot of tension on it, and the rope can break pretty easily. The right-hand diagram, you can see those flower petal-like staves, and way down in the bottom of that, you can see the cresset, a little basket made out of hoop steel into which I put lots of shavings, and I'll burn those to heat the inside of the cask. Then when I draw it in with the Dutch hand, those what start out as straight staves will bend. And as you heat the wood, the lignin begins to flow and will bend. There's no steaming, you don't soak it, you simply heat the inside, and that's why the inside of a cask is charred. Here you can see the burning of the shavings and the cresset. Remember I said when you use the draw knife, you make all those shavings, put those in a cresset and burn the shavings. They're burning inside on the diagram on the right. We also have a stick with a bit of wool on the end of it, like a sponge, very similar to what you use to clean out the inside of a cannon. And we'll use that swab to wet the inside of the cask as it's burning. One of our apprentices is making his first cask. You can see us now taking that hot cask, putting the winch on the outside of it. My friend Nate in the broad-brimmed hat has a Dutch hand, and we're tightening the cask, and then Bill begins to put the hoops on it. And Bill, the apprentice on the right-hand side, is driving those hoops down. I'm opposite him, and we work around the cask, one on each side, driving the hoops down to get them nice and even. In that image on the right, fellow in the broad-brimmed hat, myself with a red shirt, the gentleman between Bill and I with the hat, the three of us learned our trade at Genesee Country Village under Jerry Walter. Bill Vernald, who is a master brewer down at the Empire Brewery in Catskill, New York, he wanted to learn how to make casks and was one of our apprentices. So he's a third generation cooper being trained here in Central New York. Here's an original image from the 18th century of a winch. And here's my version of a reproduction sitting in the snow when I made it last winter. Once you get the head in, you tap that into the groove. It's over at Fort Clock Historic Site. And then we can trim down and smooth the outside, which Nate is doing at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown. That's a firkin that he's working on, holds about 8 gallons. And notice that's tapered top and bottom. The one I'm working on is tapered at the top. I've got it upside down because I'm putting the head in. Even if it's at the bottom, it's still the head. And there's a very happy apprentice with his first cask that he made. And now he's been training another cooper to make a cask. And that is our master cooper that taught us the skill with the hop yard behind him over at Genesee Country Village. And in the right-hand diagram, you can see a bucket for splashing water on the inside of the cask as we burn it, driving the hoops onto that hot cask. And you can also see the crescent, the little metal basket that we use to burn the objects in, sitting right next to the cask that Nate's tightening on. And sitting on the split rail fence behind him, you can see the Dutch hand that we use to tighten up that container. Now here's a group of happy apprentices, all successful in making their buckets. You notice they're all just a little bit different, depending on the skill and the style of the apprentice or the cooper. But surprisingly, when we had them cut the heads, and here at Hanford Mills Museum, they have a heading machine, so they can use water power to cut the heads, so we don't have to do it by hand. That was from the late 1850s or 1860s. But all of these coopers, to measure the heads to fit into here, they were within 1/4 of an inch, which I was very surprised. So it speaks very, very well for the interest and the skill and the care that those coopers made. Again, some completed projects. And one of the things I noticed in this project, if you look at the largest container in the right image, excuse me, largest container in the right image, you can see a stain where the hoop was. I made that for a brewer friend of mine that used it for his primary fermenter when he made beer out in the field as a reenactor. He used it one summer, took it home, put it in his garage over the winter, and the dryness of the garage during the winter had the wood shrink, and the hoop slid about 4 inches down over the wintertime. And the interior shrunk so much that he could no longer fit his primary fermenter into it. So I had to make a new one, made the new one in the image on the left. So I learned a lot about wood doing this, learned a lot about grain, learned a lot about shrinkage. It's been a very interesting project over the 20 years that I've been doing this. In the spring, I occasionally tap my maple trees in front of the house. And it's quite a sight to see the wooden sap buckets hanging on the trees. One of the coopers that I've been researching down at the Fenimore Library in the spring, in February and March, almost all of his time, 12 to 16 hours a day, were taken up with making and repairing sap buckets. The container on the left, a little cask, and I learned how to make the spigot that goes inside of it. Relatively easy little task. That is now hanging on the wall in a wing shack in a restaurant down in Charlotte, North Carolina. So that was one of the projects that I've made for custom work, bespoke work that I did for customers as a cooper. And here you can see over at Old Fort Johnson, a young lady carrying a yoke with 2 sap buckets on it, and she'd be carrying sap, collecting it out of the woods, coming up onto this time of year, and collecting that to boil down for maple syrup. The horse that I'm sitting on in the diagram, or in the image, is an original one from the William Floyd House in Westernville. Had to do some repairs on it, but it's nice to be able to use an original Cooper's horse. It's heavier and larger than the one that I made that I usually use for traveling, but a great antique to be able to put back into use. I can make reproductions. On the right is an original coopered mug made by the cooper on board the Wanderer. And as I said before, most ships had a cooper. The Mayflower had a cooper on board. In fact, Miles Standish was the cooper on board the Mayflower. He was signed on, and on the ship's crew list, he was the cooper. Columbus brought a cooper with him, with his 3 ships, when they came across to the New World in 1492. The coopers were held in relatively high esteem on the ships, and they were one of the few people that simply shared a bunk or a billet. They had separate bunks on board the ships for the cooper and the ship's carpenter. The captain was the only one that had a single billet, a single bunk, and the crew members hung their hammocks in the forecastle. So the cooper was very highly prized on board the ship. And this is one of the reproduction mugs that I made based on that original mug that's in the New Bedford Whaling Museum. National Park Service site. I had contacts with somebody that used to work there, got a hold of the specifics and the catalog information to be able to measure exactly the size of this container and reproduce that cask, or excuse me, that mug that you see in the image. It was made out of white oak, and the one on the left-hand side is made out of white oak. And I wondered why they had 2 hoops on the bottom. And one day when I was coopering, I had the mug sitting on top of my horse. It got bumped and it fell, and it landed right on the bottom because of the extra weight from the hoops. So there was a reason when you're on board ship and the ship is rocking back and forth, the extra weight on the bottom will hold it in place. I mentioned earlier the ton. As a young man in 1969, I had a chance to go up on top of this. This is one of the world's largest coopered objects. It was first filled 1752, just before the French and Indian War. Was used to collect taxes, that the people would pay their taxes in wine, and it holds 50,000 gallons. That's a lot of taxes. Also has a dance floor on the top. As a young man, when I was 16, I had a chance to dance on top of this. We had coopers here in Rome, quite a few coopers. There were roughly 16 of them right in the village and city of Rome from 1860 to 1900. 5 of them were originally born in Ireland, 3 in Germany, 1 from Poland, 1 from Switzerland, 5 from New York, and 1 from Connecticut. One of them, his son, well, Joseph Williams was father, he was 58 in 1880. His son was 21 in 1880, and he was working as a cooper also, probably in the same shop. One of the coopers, Emil Hostetler, was a cooper in a brewery And it's been interesting to look at the breweries that were here in Rome. And today, the Copper City Brewery carrying on the tradition here in Rome. I'd like to thank some folks and mention some references. The Cooperage Handbook, 1947. Kenneth Kilby probably wrote the best descriptive and historical text on coopering. He was a cooper that was still active in the 1960s. I'd like to acknowledge the Copper City Brewing Company here in Rome, the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, and I've done demonstrations of coopering at all of these sites: Fort Clock, Genesee Country Village, where my master cooper is from, Hanford Mills, where I've been teaching classes, Mystic Seaport in Connecticut, and the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And I'd like to thank Miranda and Art from the Rome Historical Society for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to share my experience and background and the fun that I've had in coopering over the years with you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bob. It's been such a pleasure to listen to your presentation. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else watching has. One pressing question that I have is, from the time that the staves are dried out, how long does it take you to finish a project?
Great question. To give you an idea, a good cooper could make a bucket in about 2.5 hours from start to finish. Wow. And that's using just dimension lumber. I typically will take an 8-foot board, cut it to the lengths of the staves, about 10 inches, 10 or 12 inches, depending on the bucket. And from start to finish, I could make a bucket in about a half a day. I'm not quite as good as some of the coopers in the 18th century. In the 18th and 19th century, the coopers could make 3 to 6 barrels or casks in a day. Now, they would work from sunrise to sunset. Interesting tale in one of the books that I've read, I think it's just Kilby's, he talks about a cooper and his apprentice, and he'd take the shavings, and while they were working, I was doing things through lunch, he'd take one of the shavings, write out his lunch order on a shaving, send it with the apprentice down to the tavern down the street. He'd get a growler of beer and his lunch, and at the end of the month, he'd go down and settle up with the tavern keeper with all the little chits of IOUs that he had on shavings from the cask.
Wow.
For me, to make a large object, to answer your question a little bit more, I could do a cask in about 4 days. I think it took me a total of about 32 hours to make the wash tub that I did. I can do, usually when I do workshops and demonstrations, I'll do a bucket in a 2-day weekend. And I will typically have the apprentices make a bucket in 2 days from start to finish.
Wow.
But I'm at the point now where I can do a bucket in less than 8 hours.
I think that's incredible. I was expecting it takes a lot more time, but it's very incredible.
And the time you put in is in the practice.
Yeah. I have one more question for you to wrap things up. Here at Rome Historical Society, we're an institution aligned with historic preservation and continued learning. So why do you think it's important to preserve the knowledge and the skill of the cooper's trade?
It's a lost art. There are not very many of us around. I'm a member of the Company of Historic Coopers. It's a group on Facebook.
Okay.
And I'd say I probably know somewhere around 20 to 24 coopers on the east coast of North America. There may be more, but there aren't a lot of us doing this. And it's a very interesting historical task, and I hate to see it lost. There are a number of institutions that still have coopers on site. And I think it's important to preserve the knowledge of those experiences and the skills and the tools. A lot of people don't know what the tools are, and to preserve those tools and to know how to use them. At the Oneida County Historical Society, or the Oneida County History Center, they have a cooper's horse. And they didn't know what it was or how it was used. And I was able to share with them a little bit about it. I learned from them about a cooper that had an article in their newspaper in 1969. He was still alive, had been working in the breweries. And it's important to share that knowledge and that information. And most of the coopers that I know are not real young. I love to see new people coming to our workshops and to our demonstrations and having a chance to learn a little bit about the skills. And I'd like to see the tradition and the knowledge passed on from generation to generation. And I've got a younger gentleman that I'm hoping to give my tools to so he can use them and to make sure that what he doesn't take is preserved at Hanford Mills Museum for teaching classes so that people can learn the skills.
But I think it's a great endeavor, very important to try and keep these traditions alive and share them with people. I hope our program, since it's recorded, people can watch it again and again, and I hope people watching can be inspired to get to learn a little bit more through you sharing your knowledge and your experience. So thank you so much for that. It's really invaluable.
Thank you, Miranda.
Yeah. So if anyone watching has any further questions, feel free to email me, educator@romehistoricalsociety.org. I will get them to Bob, and we can hopefully answer any questions you have. So thank you so much, Bob. And thank you everyone for watching, and have a good night.